12.6 cents. That is what a dollar you saved in 1971 will buy you today. Not a dollar with interest, the dollar itself, the note in the drawer, exactly as you left it. American prices are just under 8 times what they were that year. You have been told that this is simply what prices do. Weather, something that happens to everyone and is nobody's decision. It is not weather. It is a transfer, it has a direction, and at the receiving end sits the largest debtor in the world, the same institution that decides how many dollars exist. In the next 20 minutes, you will watch the United States government cut its debt by more than 8 points of national income without repaying a single dollar of it. Then you will watch it do the same thing again in your lifetime in 3 years. 2 questions run through this film. The first one is mechanical. How does a government make a debt smaller without paying any of it back, without defaulting on a cent, and without a single vote in Congress? The second question is the uncomfortable one. If this is a tax, and the current chairman of the Federal Reserve used exactly that word in testimony in July of this year, then who assessed it, who collected it, and where's the line for it on your return? Here is what you will see. The exact laws, the exact dates, and the exact numbers, all of them from the government's own published series. You will watch the federal debt grow by half in dollars and shrink by nearly 9 points as a share of the economy in the same 8 years. You will see the one man who switched the machine off and what it cost to do it. And you will see the bill. Not a bill anybody sends, but one that lands on whoever is holding dollars when it arrives. To see the machine, you have to see what a debt actually is. A government bond is a promise to pay a fixed number of dollars on a fixed date, not a promise to pay a house or a year of labor or an ounce of anything. A number. And here is the part that does all the work. The number is fixed, but what a dollar is worth is not. And the entity that decides what a dollar is worth is the same entity that owes the number. Until the 15th of August, 1971, that was only half true. On that Sunday evening, at 9 o'clock, President Nixon went on television and announced 3 things. A 90-day freeze on wages and prices, a 10% surcharge on imports, and the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. The first 2 were the headline. The third one was the one that lasted. From that evening, there was no fixed weight of metal standing behind the promise, only the promise. Now watch what that does to arithmetic. Suppose the government owes 100 and the economy produces 100, so the debt is 100% of everything. Do nothing about the debt at all. Just let every price in the country and every wage, and therefore every dollar of national income, rise by 50%. The debt is still 100. The economy is now 150. The debt has fallen to 67%, and not one payment was made. Nobody defaulted. Nobody voted. The number in the contract never changed. What changed was the thing the number is counted in, and that rate is not left to chance. The Federal Reserve targets 2% inflation a year, a target for prices to keep climbing gently forever. 2% sounds like nothing. 2% is the rate that has the value of money in 35 years. A child born today, if the official target is hit exactly, retires into a dollar worth a quarter of the one they were born under. And be precise about who picks that number, because it matters for everything that follows. No legislature voted for 2%. It is set by the Federal Open Market Committee, whose voting members are 7 governors, appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and 5 presidents of regional reserve banks, who are chosen by their own boards of directors. Nobody on that committee stands for election. That is not a scandal. It is the design, and it was chosen on purpose so that the rate could be set by people who do not have to face voters. It is also the reason the thing it produces cannot be called a tax and cannot be voted on. That is the theory. Here is the United States doing it. 1966. The federal debt stands at 39.5% of the economy. 8 years later, in 1974, it stands at 30.8%. Almost 9 points gone. Now, look at the same debt measured the way the Treasury actually owes it, in dollars. Over those same 8 years, it did not shrink. It grew by nearly 50%. Both statements are true, and they are not intention. The debt got bigger. The yardstick got smaller, and it got smaller faster. Consumer prices over those 8 years rose by almost 52%. The economy, measured in the same inflating dollars, grew faster than the borrowing did. So the ratio fell while the obligation rose. There's a name for this in the academic literature, and it is not a friendly one. Carmen Reinhardt and Belen Sprancia called it the liquidation of government debt. Their estimate of how much a government can quietly retire this way has moved between versions of the paper. 3 to 4% of national income a year in the first draft, revised down to 2 to 3, and for the United States specifically, between 1 and just over 2. I am giving you the range rather than the most dramatic number in it, because the range is what the evidence supports. And it is worth walking the ladder, because it does not look like a plan. 39.5% in 1966, 37 in 68, 35.5 in 69, and then it ticks back up in 1970, 33.7 in 72, 31.8 in 73, 30.8 in 74, which is the lowest reading in the whole 60-year series. It is not a smooth descent, and nobody announced it. It is a direction made out of ordinary years, not one of which was about the debt at all. Now, who arranged for the yardstick to shrink? This is where the story stops being abstract, because it required a decision, and the decision has a date. During the Second World War, the Federal Reserve agreed to hold the yield on long-term Treasury bonds at 2.5%. Not to aim at it, to hold it by buying whatever quantity of bonds it took. That made the war affordable. It also meant that the central bank was no longer setting monetary policy. It was managing the Treasury's borrowing costs. That arrangement ended on the 4th of March, 1951, in a joint statement of about 100 words, in which the Treasury and the Federal Reserve announced they had reached, in their words, full accord with respect to debt management and monetary policies. It is remembered as the Accord, and it is the moment the Fed got the pen back. Keep that date in mind, because the liquidation years I just showed you came after it, not before. This was not a war measure. Now the second thread. Where do the extra dollars come from? Not mostly from a printing press. The physical notes are a small part of it. They come from bank reserves and deposits, which is what economists mean by the money supply. And that brings us to the observation this whole subject is usually introduced with. In 1919, John Maynard Keynes wrote, in the 6th chapter of The Economic Consequences of the Peace, that Lenin was said to have declared the surest way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. And that Lenin was certainly right. That sentence has been quoted for a century as though Lenin wrote it. He did not. Economists went looking for it in his collected works, and it is not there. The best account we have, published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2009, traces it to a newspaper report of an interview from April 1919. So the most famous line about inflation is a paraphrase of a press report about a man who may never have said it, which is a fitting introduction to a tax nobody ever wrote down. And officials do say it out loud, when the number is embarrassing enough. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Neil Kashkari, put to an interviewer as plainly as it can be put, inflation, he said, is a tax on everybody and one you cannot escape. That is one man in one interview, so take it as his words and not an institutional position. But the current chairman of the Federal Reserve said the same thing to a committee of Congress in July of this year. It has been a tax on the American people and businesses. That is not a metaphor from a critic. It is a description from the desk that sets the rate. Put yourself inside it, because the arithmetic is the same for a household as for a treasury. It just runs the other way. It is 1971. You are careful. You have $10,000, and you do the responsible thing with it. You keep it safe. 54 years later, that money is still there. All 10,000 of it. It buys what $1,257 bought the day you put it away. Nobody took $9,000 from you. There was no transaction, No notice, no line item. Now, stand in the other position. It is the same year, and you owe $10,000 at fixed rate. 54 years later, you still owe $10,000, a number that now costs you an eighth of the effort to earn. The saver and the borrower did not trade with each other. They never met. But value moved from one to the other, and the size of the move was set by the rate of inflation, which neither of them chose. Multiply that by an economy. The largest borrower in that economy, by an enormous margin, is the federal government. The lenders are pension funds, insurers, banks, foreign central banks, and anybody holding cash, which is everybody. That is the whole mechanism, not a scheme, a direction. And it reaches wages the same way. Picture 2022. You go into your review and you come out with a 3% raise, which feels like a win because a raise is a number that goes up. Inflation that year was 8%. You took a 5% pay cut, you were told it was a raise, and the person who told you is not lying. Your salary really did go up. Both numbers are true. Only one of them is on a shelf price. That is the entire reason this tax is invisible. It is collected in a unit nobody quotes against a baseline nobody prints. So here's the whole thing in one line. This is the American Consumer Price Index, published monthly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics since 1947, and what you're looking at is not a boom or a crisis. It is a staircase that only goes one way. In 1947, the index stands at 22. Today it stands at 322. A dollar from 1947 buys just under 7 cents. Notice what the line does not do. It does not come back down. In 80 years, there is exactly one visible year of falling prices, 2009, and it fell by about a third of 1%. 80 years, and the line comes back down exactly once by a third of 1% in the worst financial crisis since the war. That is not a market that happens to trend upward. That is a design one. If this were a law of nature, nobody could switch it off. Somebody did. By 1980, American inflation reached 13.5% for the year. On Saturday, the 6th of October, 1979, in an unscheduled meeting, the Federal Open Market Committee under Paul Volcker changed what it was steering by. Instead of setting the interest rate directly, it would target the quantity of bank reserves and let the rate go wherever that took it. It took it a long way. The federal funds rate averaged 16.4% across 1981. And in a single month of that year, June, it averaged more than 19. Understand what that meant for an ordinary person. A mortgage that could not be afforded, a business loan that could not be serviced, and unemployment that averaged 9.7% across the whole of 1982. The tax was switched off, and switching it off was brutal, and everybody could see exactly who was doing it, which is the whole point. When the government stops inflation, it is a visible act with a named author and a political cost. When the government lets inflation run, it is a weather report. The same institution, the same lever, and only one of the two directions has anybody's name on it. The mistake is to file all of that under history. Look at what happened between 2019 and 2022, because it is the same sequence at speed. The money supply, the measure the Federal Reserve publishes as M2, stood at just under $15 trillion in 2019. 2 years later, it stood at $20.5 trillion. That is a 38% increase in 24 months, the fastest 2-year rise in the 60-year series. Then prices. Between 2020 and 2023, the Consumer Price Index rose almost 18%. Now, the part that is easy to miss, and it is the part that matters for a debtor. Through 2021 and 2022, the Federal Reserve held its policy rate far below the rate of inflation. In 2022, the fund's rate averaged 1.7%, while inflation ran at 8%. That gap, minus 6.3 points, is not a footnote. It is the rate at which value moves from anyone holding dollars to anyone owing them. It is a machine from 1966, running again in public with live data. Here are the two numbers side by side for the years you lived through. Between 2020 and 2022, the federal debt grew from $27.75 trillion to $31.42 trillion. That is 13% more debt in dollars in 2 years. Over the same 2 years, the debt fell from 125.6% of the economy to 117.4%. More debt, smaller debt. At the same time, from the same treasury in the same series. Nobody repaid anything. Nobody defaulted. Nobody voted. And this is the place to be careful about what I am claiming, because there's a version of this argument that goes too far. I am not telling you that somebody in Washington planned an inflation in order to shrink the debt. The record does not show that, and I will not assert what the record does not show. What the record does show is the outcome. The debt got smaller relative to the country's income. The mechanism was the falling value of the dollar, and the people whose dollars fell in value were not consulted and were never billed. Intent is a question. The transfer is a measurement. So who actually paid it? Start with wages, because that is where most people's dollars come from. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes median weekly earnings adjusted for inflation. In 1979, that figure was $331.50 in constant dollars. In 2025, it is $375. That is a rise of 13% over 46 years. The typical American worker's purchasing power has moved by about 0.25% a year across 2 generations. Now savers. In 1971, Americans saved 13.5% of their income. By 2005, that had fallen to 2.25%, and today it is 4.5%. There are many reasons for that, and I am not going to pretend inflation is the only one. But consider what the arithmetic of the last hour teaches. In a country where holding money loses you value every year by design, saving in cash is the one behavior the system reliably punishes. The Treasury even sells the antidote. Inflation-protected securities, first auctioned on the 29th of January, 1997, a bond that adjusts with the price index, sold by the same government whose debt the price index quietly shrinks. And the income tax was fixed too. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 indexed the brackets to inflation effective from 1985 because when inflation pushed people into higher brackets, that was recognized as a tax increase nobody had voted for. Congress fixed the bracket problem. It never fixed the dollar problem, because the dollar problem is the one that helps the borrower, and the borrower writes the rules. So here are the 2 answers. How does a government shrink a debt it never repays? It does not shrink the debt. It shrinks the dollar the debt is written in and lets national income catch up to a number that is standing still. 1966 to 1974, the debt grew by half and fell by nearly 9 points of the economy. 2020 to 2022, it grew by 13% and fell by 8 points. Same mechanism, 50 years apart. And why does nobody vote on it? Because there is nothing to vote on. A tax needs a bill, a chamber, a roll call, and a signature. This needs none of those, because it is not legally a tax at all. It is the arithmetic consequence of a target that a committee sets, and the committee is not on any ballot. The chairman of that committee called it a tax on the American people in testimony this July. He is not a critic of the institution. He runs it, which leaves the only question worth arguing about. And it is genuinely open. A government that could never inflate would have to pay for everything it does with taxes people vote on or borrow at rates lenders demand. And every war, every rescue, and every deficit would have to survive that vote. Would you take that country? Or is the quiet version, the one that costs you a few cents a year and never makes you choose, the price of a state that can act? Tell me which one you would sign and what you think it would cost you.